Good morning, guten Tag, everyone. My presentation for today is on one of my favorite topics, database documentation and why we need it. This has been something that's been on my mind for many years, and I thought I would put some thoughts down on my experience with it and possibly give you some tips on how to deal with this in your jobs as you go on. So a little bit about me. My name is Mala. I've been working with SQL Server as a DBA, and I'm currently a data engineer at an amazing company called Channel Advisor Corporation. I've been involved with SQL Server since 1996. I think I started with SQL Server 6.5, and I've been in love with the product since then. I've also been part of the SQL Server community, or the now extinct PASS organization, since 1999. So I'm not exactly a new star. I'm quite an old star, just out of touch with speaking. And I want to thank Ben and William for giving me this opportunity to get back in touch with speaking. I'm also a co-lead with Data Platform Women in Technology group and the TriPass SQL Server user group locally. And locally meaning I live at Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'm on Twitter as SQLMAL. So for today's talk, I'm going to be talking about what we call documentation, why we should document, what happens if there's documentation, and what happens if there is no documentation, what are the different types and categories of documentation that are there, and what is applicable when and to whom. And lastly, the million-dollar question that most of us have when we think of documentation is, how the hell do I get started, or where do I get started? So hopefully I'll be able to give you some tips on how you can get started on this. If you already work at an organization that is very documentation friendly, then that's great, but that's usually not the norm. It's sort of an orphan stepchild that nobody likes to do. So most people who are interested, they are baffled by how do we get started? There is so much to do. So I want to offer some tips in that direction on where you can go with this as we go along. So what counts as documentation? It could be any of these things. It could be extended properties, which is the simplest form of documentation there is. It resides along with your data, so it's kind of easy to do. It could be comments in your code, which is also really easy. And it does count as documentation when you don't have anything else. A really well-documented piece of code, for example, is Adam Mechanics SP, who's active. If you study that, it's not just an excellent piece of code, it's also very well documented. You can see him explain every parameter, all the possible uses, why he set it up the way he did, and everything. So that definitely counts as documentation. The third one is data dictionary, which is possibly the most elaborate form of documentation you can have. It is a grid that explains every data element you have in your database with all the properties, all the constraints, keys, indexes, everything. So it's really useful if you want to do an in-depth data analysis of anything. And then you have your ER diagrams. You're really lucky if you inherit an ER diagram, but if not, you can make, re-engineer it from existing tables and make your own. And ER diagrams can be really useful if you want to understand how tables are interrelated and what are the keys and various stuff like that. And lastly, you have the old-fashioned data flow diagrams. And I put that down as the very last because that is the kind of documentation that cannot be automated, at least not so far. If you want to have a data flow diagram, it can be very useful, but the process of doing it can be very time consuming and it is difficult and if not impossible to automate. But all these things, except for code comments, of course, which you do as you go along, they are not that, they don't take that much of effort and you can automate it. Once you set it up, it's possible to automate it as you go on. So all this counts as documentation, but what it really is there is a wonderful quote that Joe Selko had in his book that nobody could read his code, so we could not fire him. So there are these kind of people who tend to hoard their stuff in the interest of job security or whatever else, intentionally writing obscure code or hoarding information so that they cannot get fired. All of us have had to deal with people like that at some point. So it could be this person, or it could be, a really earnest person like maybe you or me who want to move on to doing something else, but we are branded experts. We have this monkey on our backs that we cannot get off, and everybody wants to come to us when they want to get a certain thing done, but you don't get to go anywhere because you're the only person who knows that stuff. So documentation, in essence, hopefully you're the second kind of person, if not the first, but documentation can help you get out of this kind of scenarios. It can get you promoted if you are willing to put in the effort and what is needed to document what's in your head and help other people learn it. Then it has the potential to get you promoted. So regardless of whatever format you use, at the different formats we talked of in the earlier slide, it could be anything. But if you are able to get the knowledge out to somebody else, then it does have the potential to help you move on to doing something else. So what if you don't document? Now, there are two main fallouts of not documenting something. The first one is that impact analysis becomes a bear. It's really hard for someone to just go with code or with data to understand everything that's impacted and do a good job of whatever it is they are supposed to do. And sometimes you get requests from the business that may seem like really small from their perspective, like why don't you update this one record or delete these things? And suddenly you see a lot of things breaking because you don't know what that actually impacted. So impact analysis is really painful when you don't have proper documentation. The second thing is that this creates an environment of fear and mistrust in the company. Like nobody wants to touch something because you're scared that's going to break. And if it does break, there is a lot of finger pointing that this person said it and that person said it, and I didn't know it was going to do that and all of that. And that does not help in growing the product or creating a positive, a good environment for anybody to work in. So nobody knows what that is. Let's leave it alone is really not a good thing to do with any kind of software. It needs maintenance. It needs people to understand what it is. Some examples I'm going to be going over to illustrate what this can be. One of them is, let's take a table with a field called update date. This is a very common naming standard for any kind of table. Now, suppose you have a table like this and you are tasked with something to do on this table. You are tasked with maybe, run a report off of what is there in this table, or may insert some data or update something or whatever. So when I get a table like this, some thoughts come to my mind when I look at this field called update date. Is there a time limit on updating old invoices here? Does it mean I can update anything at any time? Is update date populated for new invoices, or is it just for an old invoice? And lastly, I can't see that. Is update date updated for every update to every field, or is it just for certain fields? Now, there are two ways that somebody would go about figuring this out. One of them is by researching data, and the other one is by researching code. And both of this has its limits and its pros and cons. Researching data, for one thing, it can be useful, but it does not mean that any situation cannot happen. Like, for example, you don't find any invoice that is over 5 years old that has the update date changed. That doesn't mean you cannot change it. Or in other words, there is a line that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That is what is true when you try to investigate things with data. It is one way to do it when you don't have any other option, but it is really not the best way. The second way is by investigating code, and you can possibly get to answers like is update date populated for new invoices by looking into code. But there may be many situations where you may not even have access to code, or you may not be in a position, it may be written in some language that you don't particularly understand or are familiar with. So there may be many situations where that's not even possible. Now, instead of all that, suppose you had a neat piece of documentation that told you what this was about. Like date invoice was changed, updated for invoice amount, only changeable 90 days after creation. Now, if you have something like this answers at least two of the questions that I had. That is there a time limit on updating? Okay, so 90 days, I can only do it that much. And then is update date updated for update to every field? Possibly not. It says only invoice amount. So maybe the third one, I can do some analysis with the help of code or data and figure it out. But it does help you get further than what you were without it. So that is one example. Let's look at a second one. The second one is you have 3 tables and you're tasked with finding all orders with the shortest gap between due date and ship date. Now, this kind of instruction comes from somebody in the business. That person does not know how the fields like due date is defined in your database, and possibly they don't care. They just want a report like this, and they expect you as a data person to figure out what this really means. So when you have 3 tables like this, you're really not sure is expected delivery date the due date, or is due date something that is defined in terms and conditions that I don't particularly know about. It could be anything. And if you look at order detail here, it has an item ship flag, which means different items can be shipped at different times. So how do I find out if this invoice actually fits that criteria? And then there is an order shipment table with a shipment date. What does that mean? So this kind of stuff is really hard to figure out. And even if you have access to code as well as the data, you really cannot say if expected delivery date is the same thing as the due date. You really do need documentation to validate this kind of a scenario. So if you have an extract from a data dictionary that tells you what that is, that expected delivery date is also called the due date. Due date is the latest date the order can be completed, and all of this stuff. Now you know what this actually means, and you have confidence that you possibly need to write some kind of an aggregation query to figure out if this invoice is really fits the criteria of the orders with the shortest gap or not. So that's how it's really helpful, that when you have scenarios where neither data nor code will help you understand what you need to do for any situation. The third example, if you've ever been a DBA, you would be familiar with this, is if you get a call in the middle of the night that a web page is timing out, for example, and you don't know what's feeding that page, and you don't have anybody who's a programmer who's around. In some cases you may, some cases you may not, and you're not sure which server you should look at, which database you should look at, what exactly is causing this problem or anything. Now, I want to be very clear that database documentation, theoretically at least, it does not include the documentation or runbooks typically that operational DBAs use. That is a whole different kind of technical documentation, and there are different rules and ways you can write that. But it can be an input into writing that kind of documentation. So if I have something like this, if I have a data flow diagram that tells me the customer master feeds in the sign-in page and the welcome web page, and one of these pages is timing out, now I know where to go and look. The customer master resides in a certain database, and that is probably what is causing the timeouts. I know where to go and look for that. So I'm not saying that, DBAs get up in the middle of the night and read data flow diagrams. That typically does not happen. But you're able to make some kind of documentation for your on-call DBA using something like this, that, this happens now and then, so this is where you need to look if something happened. It is very helpful as an input to make that kind of documentation, if you happen to have it. So what if you do document? Now, we saw a few examples of what happens if you do document. It creates, it makes your impact analysis really easier, and it is the single source of truth. Now, there's no finger pointing or different people thinking different things about what this data means. So you can go there to understand what it is, and you can understand how something evolved. This is particularly true of comments in code, like how things change from what it was to what it is, and That can be very helpful when you're trying to introduce something new or you don't understand why things were set up a certain way. And lastly, and this is something your management is really going to like, is that new employees get to speed really quickly. So this is pretty important when you're working in a busy environment and you're trying to train somebody. If you have the documentation that is needed for them to understand something, then they get to speed really quickly. And that is a really good sell to your management when you want to build a case for documentation. So the next question is, why are databases difficult to document? Now, databases are particularly difficult to document because there is so much of change and flux. And when you work in a busy shop, like the one I do, there are multiple people touching multiple areas of the database, and you don't know where to start or how to keep up with the whole thing. And then you're not sure who your audience will be. Typically, when you work in some places where people are very used to not referring to anything and just, the knowledge buried in somebody's head, or no, I'm going to go and ask this person, and that person has been around for a long time. And if they're used to working a certain way like that, you're unsure who your audience will be when you're trying to build, something new or some documentation to work with. And who's going to maintain it? This is probably the most post question when you take this to a manager or somebody and ask time to do documentation is, okay, you're going to get started with this, but you're not going to be the only person working on this. So who's going to maintain it? And lastly, what type of documentation works best for us? So I'm going to attempt to give some tips on how to get started with this and probably address what type of documentation works best for what kind of people and what situation. Okay. What happened? Oh, something happened.
I think you might have just dropped out of it. If you just continue from current spot, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you hit Shift F5, it'll take you right back to wherever you're at. So if you just go to the slide and then press Shift F5, it'll play from wherever you were at. Perfect.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so let's look at the types of documentation. There are two different types of documentation, essentially. One is prescriptive and the other is descriptive. Prescriptive documentation is typically what is written from a business point of view purely, and is more applicable and more easier to use by people on the business side of things. Some example of prescriptive documentation include logical ER diagrams, logical data flow diagrams, and data requirements documents if you happen to have them. Now, descriptive documents are the ones that technical people like us use. They are about how things are actually implemented in practice, and some of these include physical ER diagrams or stuff that is reverse engineered, and then a physical data flow diagrams and data dictionary. Now, let's look at each of these and see how they work. Logical data flow diagrams are typically at the highest level. They are built by people who are modeling the system, and they describe the flow of data through the system purely from a business point of view. They're really easy to understand, and they typically are the best tool you have to communicate with users or people from business point of view, customers and things like that, people like that. And they are independent of any kind of technology or technical terms. Now, large data flow diagrams in general, logical or physical, they use very minimal symbols. The symbols they use are external entities, which is typically an oval like this, processes, which is a rectangle with a square, rounded edges, data stores, which are the three-sided rectangle, and data flows, which is the arrows that connect all of these things. So they're not flow charts. It's important to understand that they don't have like, yes, no, you go here if this happens and that kind of stuff. They're not that detailed. They only explain to you how data flows through the system. And there is a line of thought in today's world, at least, that DFDs are for waterfall-based models, and they're really, not relevant anymore. I personally disagree with that. I find that these extremely useful when you have to understand, especially if you have many different applications and many different, websites, and data flows has a complex flow. I think this is the easiest way for you to understand how that works, if you have the people and the effort needed to keep it up. So a logical data flow diagram is how data flows from the point of view of the business or non-technical users. Now, the physical data flow diagrams are about how it's going to be implemented. And it's a lot more detailed than logical data flow diagrams are. It includes different things like temporary data stores, validations, all the different kinds of stuff that you need. And this is typically useful if you're a technical person and to understand how things work, how it's implemented. There are many great tools on the market that can help you make DFDs, Visio, and there is one called Lucidchart, which I really like, and Visual Paradigm too. These are all paid tools. I don't think Lucidchart is very expensive. Visio comes with your Office subscription if your company is willing to pay for it. Let's look at an example now of logical versus physical data flow diagrams. This is a really simple example of a speaker submitting a session to a conference, such as this one. So for a logical diagram, the speaker submits a session, conference session, you validate the session info, and it goes to the list of submitted sessions. That's literally all it is. And from a business point of view, that's all somebody needs to know. But if you translate this into the physical world, you have a lot of other things here. You have the profile validation, and then you go to a session validation, and then it props up the terms and conditions. And then if the person is okay with the terms and conditions, then it generates a confirmation for them. So it gives you the whole entire flow, which you as a techie may find very useful if you have to look at how things are flowing at a high level. So this is basically the difference between the two. One is at a very high level and one has a lot of detail. But the symbols used and various things are exactly the same. So it's kind of similar. The concept is similar with logical ER diagrams. ER diagrams are also set up from a business point of view. And you can talk an entire day on logical versus physical ER diagrams and how one translates to another and so on. It's a very in-depth topic and something that architects love to talk about. But I'm just giving a very basic idea of what they mean. This is at a very high level of the pictures of entities needed for a business, the information gathered from the business requirements, and then you just create the entities and some of the attributes of the entities. Theoretically, at least, there are different levels and logical ER diagram evolves. One is at a really high level, and then you add keys to the entities, and then you add different attributes to the entities. And like it is with the data flow diagram, logical diagrams are typically useful to people on the business side. And the same tools that you build, some of the same tools you can use to build ER diagrams also. And ERWin is a really prominent one in that area. Physical ER diagrams are how you translate the logical ER diagrams into the physical world. So you add all the constraints, the indexes, and all different things that are there, and you can reverse engineer a physical diagram too from an existing database. It's really easy to do. You can do it with Visio, you can do it with SSMS database diagrams as well. And this is what we as techies look to support our needs if we want to understand how tables are laid out. So the same tools as we had earlier. And look at how things are different. This is an example of a logical diagram that has an order, a shipment, and a customer. And here you can see the whole thing is normalized with keys and how the relationships are laid out with all the entities. And you can have keys on the side too, but it's a little bit different from how you define the key physically in a database. So this is how they are different. A data dictionary is by far the most detailed form of documentation, database documentation that you can have. A data dictionary has every entity defined with all the attributes. It helps you understand how consistent these entities are in the database, and it is really, really useful to maintain an in-depth analysis of data. There are many tools that can help you with creating a data dictionary. You can also write queries, and I'm going to demo a query towards the end to show how you can do this on a homegrown basis. You can export it from the query into something that you want to maintain, an Excel sheet or whatever other format you may like, and you use this as a starting point for your data analysis. And it can be really useful because it gives you the complete picture of what the database is about, with all its elements and all the constraints and everything that you need to know. So last kind of documentation that we're going to talk about is a data requirements document. Now, I would consider myself really lucky if I worked somewhere that actually had a data requirements document for me to look at. This is something that is done at the start of the project. It helps you identify who the stakeholders and the owners are. It is primarily for the business to understand how to evolve the product as they go along. And there is no set format or anything for a data requirements document. It just depends on what the company chooses to do in that regard. And the format is very organization specific. So we looked into all that, all the different types of database documentation that are there. Logical is what we meant to do. Physical is what actually happened, or how, how the logical diagram was implemented in practice. So the first question that anyone has when they consider doing documentation is, if you take it to your boss, is it really worth your time? And I like this illustration from this cartoon that shows you how small increments of time can add up and into something really useful or valuable. How much you shave off, how much time you shave off from each task, and how often you do that task, and you multiply that, and over time it can add up. So that's how you tend to prove value for something like this, something that is not easily accepted as important to do unless people actually understand how it adds up over time. So where do I start? This is the $1 million question that most people have. Where do you start when you want to do documentation? There are typically 4 phases that you can think about. Is who is your primary audience? Who are you trying to help by doing this? What are their goals? What are those people trying to accomplish by having some documentation? Then identify some quick wins that you can create in that area. And lastly, what are the resources, including the tools that can help you with getting there? So let's look at the first 2 questions first. Who is your primary audience and what are their goals? Now, in most cases, there is nobody who has an audience. It could be just you. And how relevant it is to you depends on your role in the business. So just me is a completely acceptable answer when you're trying to start out with something like this. And if you're somebody on the business side and you want to identify how the data flows through the system, you want to write better stories, you want to understand how to talk to different people in the business, then you're probably better off with something like a logical data flow diagram for this purpose. If you are a technical person, if you're a developer, you want to understand how the tables are connected and how to do better impact analysis or write better stored procedures or whatever else you're doing with code, then a physical ER diagram or a data dictionary would be incredibly useful. If you're a DBA, you are trying to understand what is feeding the application, or what happens when you get a call in the middle of the night, what are the server or the databases you need to look at, then any of these things can actually be helpful for you to build a run book or some kind of operational instructions on what to do when something like that happens. So what kind of documentation you need typically depends on your role in the business and who you can serve best with it. And this may help you, offer you some kind of guidelines on what kind of documentation you can do. Now let's look at the second step, is how you grow some quick wins. Now, quick wins are around developing, a cycle of growth. That is, you show them some small victories, and then you share them with whoever is in the business, and then what value that has brought, and then get the support you need for doing that for the next project or the next task or whatever it is. And you keep doing this multiple times, and like that cartoon we saw some time ago, this adds up to considerable wins, and then you can get support for buying that expensive tool or getting some time carved off or getting the credit you deserve for doing something, repeatedly like this. So gathering quick wins, how do you get to gathering quick wins? You may want to think of classifying the work you do into different categories. Something you do very frequently, like for example, maybe there is a really important ETL that you have to check on every day, make sure that that's working right, and whatever output has to go to a customer or somebody else. There may be something that is semi-frequent, like for example, you're onboarding a customer and there are a list of tasks that you have to do for that. So that may be something that is you don't do very often, but when you do, there may be steps that you don't remember from the last time and you may need to put it down for you to do, or maybe for somebody else to do. That may be possible. Or there may be something really critical, like a customer is not able to access something today. So what do you do when that happens? So you have different types of categories like this. And lastly, what happens if you go on vacation? Any of these things above could happen, and people have to know what to do when you're not around. So you classify your task into things like this, and you decide which one of them you're going to document so that people can see, somebody other than you can do this task without asking you or without, feeling frustrated that they don't know how to do it. That would classify as a win. And the more boxes like this you get around to documenting and showing that kind of wins, the more quick wins you have. So going back to that cartoon again, that's how you build some quick wins, and then you share them with your team, and then they realize the value in doing this, and then you get more support for doing it. So this cycle has to go around multiple times before you build considerable support for your case, or how do you get started with doing it. So what resources do I have? Now, there are many categories of resources. The first kind of resources are those that are available for free with SQL Server. What are the 2 documentation resources available with SQL Server that are for free? Anybody?
You got silence.
Okay. The 2 resources available with SQL Server for free are extended events and SSMS database diagrams. You can also write DMV queries to create a data dictionary. That's also free. That can be done with SQL Server, and I'll show you an example. The second categories are paid tools, but they may be part of a bigger suite that your company already owns and you don't even know they exist. Visio, for example, comes as part of the Office suite, and some companies own it, but it does have a cool reverse engineering feature, which they took it away some time ago when it came back. So if they're already using Visio, then you may want to look at reverse engineering some of your databases and create some ER diagrams with it. And if they already own it, that's not going to cost them any extra money for you to use it. The second one is a really cool tool that Redgate has, that is SQL Doc, and that is part of the Redgate tool belt. I worked at many shops that own Redgate tool belt, and they don't even know that this exists. They typically use it for what it is really known for, that is the database compare options. But this little thing is nugget, this is hidden there, and this helps you make data dictionaries and keep it up to date. So if they already have the Redgate tool belt, then it's not going to cost them any money to use this other thing either. These are ways you can use existing tools to make some documentation. Lastly, you have the expensive tools like Apex SQL Doc, which is a really awesome tool, and some others that I've listed down here. These are not cheap. These may be worth looking into if you built a case big enough so that the management really understands that documentation is absolutely worth doing. So we don't mind investing in something for you to do it. But to start with, I would begin with whatever you have for free, or possibly something that is already part of a bigger suite that your company owns already. So SQL Server Resources, so let's look at some pros and cons of the 2 resources that SQL Server has. Now, extended properties are free, and the metadata and the data reside together, which I think is kind of cool, and they're really, really easy to access. What is hard about them maybe is that they're sort of clunky. There is no way you have to browse all the extended properties at one shot other than maybe writing a query or doing something like that with it. So that is a disadvantage. And SSMS database diagrams, and I know enough architects who don't like it at all because it is just literally so small and difficult to work with. But I think it's free. And I think, you can reverse engineer a small group of tables like really soon. It auto updates if there are any changes to those tables. The issues are like, it's not actually a data modeling tool. It's just a small utility that comes with SSMS. It is buggy. I've run into lots of bugs with it. It's limited in size, really difficult to print. It does not organize itself well, and you cannot export it anywhere. You just have to save it and let it sit there. So, but again, like I said before, it is something you can start with. And if you have a lot of tables, the way I do it is I create multiple small diagrams with tables that are related to each other and perhaps specific to a specific, functionality like invoicing, for example, or purchasing or payroll or whatever the case may be. So you can group it like that and create multiple smaller diagrams and then, work with that. That's one way to work with it. And it doesn't cost anything as compared to the really expensive ER modeling tools that are out there. So those are some options that are possible with SQL Server Resources. Now I'm going to demo a small script that can create a data dictionary for you and export it to an Excel file. Okay. Now, the original idea of the script was from Mladen, the amazing MVP from Slovenia. I'm not even going to say his last name. I don't know how to say it. But his was the script that he wrote way back in the days of a SQL Server 2000. So I tried to modernize it a little bit for 2012 and further. This does require XP command shell because you're exporting from SQL Server into something outside. So if your DBAs don't like it, you can possibly pull the query out of here and run it inside like this and then export it manually to whatever else you need. Otherwise, you can set this up as a job. It will create an Excel file and refresh it over and over, maybe every night or something. So it's a simple homegrown way of maintaining a data dictionary if that's what you choose to do. Okay, this is just a warning, nothing to worry about. And I'm going to look at where I have here. And I have the data dictionary that it created. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So you have everything here that you need, right? You have every database, every table, every field and constraint and how big it is and all the stuff. So very, very useful if you want to do any kind of analysis with data or anything like that. That's it. Okay, let's go back. So summarizing everything, what I would like to say is to start small, use maintainable free tools to begin with, be consistent with whatever you want to do, like keep showing what you're doing, the rewards, like this is how much time I saved with impact analysis because I had written down everything that is involved in this process. Keep working the consistency part, that's really important. Be careful with labels. This is particularly what I'd like to say to ladies in particular. Documentation is everybody's job. If the company wants to do it, a lot of people, especially programmers, they don't like to do it. And some people like to even brag about how much they hate to do it. But once the company decides that it's needed, it's everybody's job. And it's really easy, especially for us as willing ladies on the team, to be stuck with doing everybody else's documentation. So be careful. If you want to have a career as a technical writer, and if you really enjoy this stuff, that's a whole different line of work to go into, and that's totally worth it if that's what you want to do. But if you want to remain in your role and just document what is relevant to you, be sure that other people are doing what's expected of them, and it's not your job to do everybody else's documentation. Really important to remember, because I've been here and I've been stuck with the person who wants to do documentation, which really wasn't my goal. Try to make it part of the CI process so that it maintains itself. You can automate it. Some of the tools listed, like the manual data dictionary, if you set it up as a job, it will regenerate every night and maintain itself as you go along. So the more you automate, the easier it's going to be for you to get approval and make it part of the CI process. And these are some resources, really good resources that you can look into if you're interested in taking this any further. Thank you. Any questions, Erin?
Awesome. Thanks, Mala. None that have come in yet. So Kendra has one, and it won't let her put it in the Q&A. Do you have an example of a well-working documented system that you worked with, and what made it really good? And if you can't give a ton of specifics, like, we totally understand.
Yeah, I worked at a couple of places like that. What made it really good was two things. One was that one place I worked at, I'll give two examples. One place I worked at was actually a DBA heavy shop that had, some excellent run books. And this was way, back in the days of 2005. What I found it really easy was about it was that as a new DBA, I could come up to speed like really quickly, because the documentation was so friendly, so well written, and there were sandboxes or environments that I could actually try out these things, step by step. And they had some issues. Sometimes they didn't work as it was documented, but still I had a confidence. Like, for example, when I was my first job as a senior DBA with SQL Server 2005 was to build a cluster and learn how to failover clusters. And I was absolutely terrified because I had no experience in this area. I didn't know how clusters work, and I didn't know what to do. And I was frantically Googling and, looking for blog posts and things like that. And every environment is different, and there are limits to what blog posts and technical articles can teach you. So you're not sure if what you're doing is 100% right just by reading that. But they had such excellent step-by-step documentation and what happens, including screenshots of what happens when you fail over this, this server, and what happens, how the icons change, or what looks, or when you should panic, or how long you should wait, everything. So when it was documented, it gave me confidence. It made it very easy for me as a new DBA to come up to speed. So that was one example. I don't think that classifies as database documentation necessarily, but it still was good documentation. They took time and they took pains to do it. And it really shortened the learning curve for a new DBA. It gave them better confidence. The environment itself was very positive and very, it changed a lot of things. The second example was more of like a business environment where they still had, in fact, data flow diagrams. So it was a very complex business where you had to, you didn't really know off the top of your head what data was used by who and how. So they had these excellent flow diagrams like the one I showed below, that if you had a problem with a web page, or if you had a problem that a specific customer from a specific area of a business, such as somebody from payroll is calling you to say, hey, I'm having an issue with this table, this data doesn't look right or something, you knew where to look because you know how the data came from. It came from this, SAS-based system into these tables into here. So now I know. So probably the issue is not with my SQL Server-based tables. It's from where it's getting the data from, that SAS-based system. So I better go and ask the SAS admin what's going on there. So that's how it worked. And, those are the kind of situations I have found documentation to be very useful. I hope I answered it.
Yeah, those are some good examples. And I do have some more questions. So you had your demo there. Are you going to make that in your deck available? Yes. So that, okay, so that yes, they'll get that posted on GitHub for okay, so that'll show up there. So here's another question. If you are using some source system for your data warehouse, but it lacks documentation, how can you pretty quickly create a simple one for your ETL process?
So ETL documentation is really hard. Okay, there is only one tool actually in the market, the tool that Pragmatic Works had, and that is now owned by SentryOne, that is capable of documenting an ETL. SSIS based ETL, that too, not on any other tool. But I'm not aware of any automated tool that can help you with documenting an ETL, and documenting ETL is quite painful. The only way you can do it is by using a flowchart, a manual painful flowchart. And it would help if you had the source from where your data is coming from, if they had something to help you with, like what are their table layouts and such. And what I have found useful to do for ETLs is to create mapping diagrams. That is, like an Excel sheet laying out, okay, it's coming from table A, then in the middle I have whatever transforms it's going through, and then to the right I have table B. So that does not cover every aspect of my ETL, but that helps to some extent for me to understand how data changes, or if there is any data change as it comes in. So that's the simplest thing you can do, is to create a mapping from source to destination. And sadly, there aren't any tools that I know of, at least, that can help there. It has to be manual.
Leslie did mention in the chat, she mentioned Purview. She said it's a paid option. I don't know if I'm not familiar with that.
I've not heard of that.
Okay, but Leslie has some knowledge there that she might be able to share.
Yeah.
It's an Azure product.
Oh, wow.
Okay, there's another question. What is your experience in getting management support for implementing documentation standards? How do you approach that?
Oh, documentation standards. I guess that implies that you've gone one step further in making sure documentation is something that is needed. So that itself is a big step. So congratulations. So if they consider documentation important, then we get around to discussing documentation standards. But if you're not quite there, don't bring up standards, because it tends to make it very intimidating. And I've been through this many times. If they don't have a good handle on how useful documentation can be, then I would not even talk about standards. But if they've gone past that, then yeah. What is important by way of standards is that if different people write things in different ways, then it's really hard for someone reading it to put it together. That's consistency, or how it looks, is very, very important in standards. So I gave an example of Adam Mechanics SP, who's active some time ago. If you read the comments he has on the header, they are very consistent. They look like, the same standards for capitalization, for tabbing. So this variable, this parameter has to be passed for this reason. And here are the different scenarios, what you can pass to it. And he uses the same thing, in multiple ways across the whole history of the whole code. And it's a lot of documentation for a stored proc too. So you can give an example, examples like that to say it enhances readability. It makes people easier to understand if they write it in one consistent format like that, instead of 20 different ways. So that's your best way to go about that. Yeah.
So do you have suggestions for, as you said, before getting to standards, you need to have buy-in for writing documentation or creating documentation.
Right.
Do you have recommendations for how to get that buy-in if a company or management is resistant to that, or it just doesn't even exist?
So that's actually the reason why I even want to talk about this. That buy-in, like I said before, that comes in really small chunks, like small rewards. Take small portions of your work that are really important, that are critical, document it for yourself, and show them that you did your work better because this was documented. And you have to build your case on a small piece by quick wins, so piece by piece basis like that. Like you're out on vacation and somebody else has to do your job, and you've documented these things. Maybe ask that person how easy it was for them to do it. And if they say yes, now that's a win. So that's how you build your wins, is on a case by case basis. So look for somebody who's writing a complex story or something like that, and struggling with impact analysis, supply them with something you've done and see how it makes their life easier. So there you have a second win. So you have to build multiple wins like that for you to sell your case. And to be honest, it doesn't sell everywhere. So the farthest you can go in some shops is that to keep whatever documentation you do for yourself and do your job better. And sometimes that's the best you can do. And it's still worth doing because it will make your life easier.
That's a great point. That's a great point right there.
Yeah.
This is a comment, but this is an interesting point. So I have a question for you after this. So one of the attendees wrote, I tried to implement extended properties as documentation, and I wrote a daily running script checking to see if all objects that were defined to be documented had extended properties. So the recommendation here is keep your housekeeping of documentation automated so that you're aware if something's missing, right? Because we're human, we tend to,
Yes.
forget to do things sometimes like that.
Yes.
So do you have any examples or any scenarios where you did something similar in terms of some kind of an automation or a methodology to make sure that documentation exists?
Now, I've worked at a couple of places where extended events was mandatory if you're trying to make any kind of change. And that, sorry, I didn't say extended events. Extended property.
I was like, I know what you're talking about.
So what you said has been mandatory at a couple of places I worked at, and that has definitely proved to be useful. Some rare places also have things like update, making sure your ER diagrams are up to date, especially if you add a new table or make a significant change to an existing table, make sure that all those links, work like they should. That was another one. And this example that I gave with the data dictionary, this is really, really common. So every time there is a change, because a data dictionary is the most used document for people to do any kind of impact analysis, to make sure that it gets generated and refreshed every time you make a change to enforce that. Or better still, if you automate it, then, it works fine.
Yeah!